And we are recording. Okay. Hello, everyone. My name is Adam Cross. I am a licensed marriage family therapist in Southern California. I'm also a youth minister at my local parish here. And today I am talking with Dr. Peter Malinoski, and we have a really good topic today on OCD and scrupulosity, which I think at least in my practice, is coming up quite a bit. So I'm excited to have this conversation. So I want to, turn it over a little bit to Dr. Peter and, invite him to tell us a little bit about himself and Souls and Hearts. So do you want to tell us a little bit about that?
Yeah, I'd be happy to get into that. So I'm a clinical psychologist in Indiana. I've been a psychologist for 19 years, and the real passion, what really brought me into psychology, was to really ground the practice of psychology in a Catholic anthropology, in a Catholic worldview. That's really what I'm passionate about, Adam. And so it's not just about reducing symptoms. It's not just about feeling better. It's not just about functioning better. It's about shoring up the natural foundation for the spiritual life. So, St. Thomas Aquinas tells us grace perfects nature. And one of the things that I see all the time is that there's so much disruption, so much disorder, so much confusion on a natural level, that for so many people it makes the building of the spiritual edifice, it makes that construction of the spiritual building, that makes it really, really difficult. And so I kind of see mental health professionals, Catholic mental health professionals, as kind of like St. John the Baptist, right? Preparing the way for the spiritual life. We work in the natural realm, but we do that with an eye to improving the spiritual, really kind of like being able to form that. And so Souls and Hearts flowed out of that. Souls and Hearts is our online outreach that grounds the practice of psychology. It grounds psychology in a Catholic worldview, and that really reaches out to ordinary practicing Catholics that are interested not only in spiritual growth, but in overcoming the natural obstacles, the psychological obstacles to that growth, and who can also use online resources. So we have 3 podcasts that we do on a weekly basis. We have all kinds of courses, classes, blogs. We have a community of folks, the Resilient Catholics Carpe Diem community, that gets together to kind of work through things. And so it's a huge resource for folks out there. We actually bring together dozens of Catholic mental health professionals, and so it's a great thing. The podcast I do is the Coronavirus Crisis Carpe Diem podcast, which is all about helping people to be more resilient in the face of this crisis. So it's a blessing to be able to be a part of that, and we've been going since about November of last year. So.
Ooh, nice. And I like how you said kind of like John the Baptist, right? We're paving the way and really pointing to Jesus.
If what we're doing as mental health professionals is not at least indirectly helping people along the road to their salvation, then at best we're wasting our time.
Yeah.
Then at best we're wasting our time and their time, right? As best so this, and what happens is that once you have that order in the natural realm, it makes it so much easier to deal with the analogous spiritual aspects, right? So people that have a lot of trouble with their earthly fathers, their natural fathers, for example, they often have such difficult times relating to God as Father, right? So there are these parallels, and if you can resolve the disorder on the natural realm, it really opens the door to so much spiritual growth.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. So we're pointing to the bigger question, the questions.
Right.
And I think we find that in kind of secular psychology, if you take God out of it, if you take out those big questions of faith, life, and meaning, you kind of get stuck with, I'm going to find my happiness. I'm going to find my truth, type of thing.
Right.
And that is very disappointing, to say the least, right?
And the fundamental, every practice of psychology is grounded in some kind of worldview. It's grounded in some kind of anthropology. And the dominant one in secular psychology is really hedonism. Yeah. It's how do you maximize pleasure and minimize pain. Yeah. There are other ones, that are out there, but there's as many anthropologies as there are mental health professionals, right? So, you
Yeah.
know, and it's really important because how you answer those questions of, you know, who am I, who is God, what is the meaning and purpose of life, how you answer those questions as a clinician has an incredibly powerful bearing on how you actually practice, right? So you can imagine if you go to a feminist psychologist, for example, you know, that practice of psychology is going to be grounded in whatever that clinician's idea of feminism is, right? And so similarly, you know, psychology doesn't answer those questions. The questions around theology, philosophy, epistemology, and metaphysics, they're all kinds of assumptions that go in to inform the psychology. It doesn't happen the other way around. And so you've got to have, you know, it's helpful to have, if you're Catholic, it's really helpful to have a clinician that really grips onto a Catholic understanding of those 4 particular disciplines.
Yeah.
So.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
And especially when you're dealing with something like scrupulosity, right?
Yeah.
Because then
Yeah,
you're dealing with this interface between a spiritual issue and a psychological issue, right? And so there are particular kinds of themes, of topics that come up in therapy where that's vitally important.
yeah, yeah. And you think about it, a lot of people they don't walk into therapy and say, hey, what's your worldview on this, you know, or what's your, you know, what's your foundation. But that's so
But
critical.
it's really important to ask that question. In Souls and Hearts, we have a question. We have a whole course on. It's a free course on how to choose a therapist, a Catholic's Guide to Choosing a
Cool.
Therapist. And there are interview questions that you can take to your therapist. And some of them, I think, sometimes people think are a little I don't know. Maybe sometimes people think they're rude, but I think it's perfectly appropriate to ask your clinician. You know, to ask a clinician that you're interviewing to work with you, like,
Yeah.
what his religious beliefs are, what her worldview is.
Yeah.
Because, you know, like I said, that's going to have a huge impact on the therapy.
Yeah.
You know?
And I find, like you said, scrupulosity, but the other big one is sexuality, right? When that comes
Oh
to
yeah.
therapy, you quickly
Well,
find out what worldview your therapist is taking. So
well, and marital therapy in particular too, right? If you just believe that marriage is just a social contract, you know, versus a sacramental bond, there's
yes,
going to be a very different approach
yeah,
to how the clinician looks at that.
yeah,
And, you know, and then that it's going to have an influence, and not only in the therapy, but, you know, on the clients as well.
yeah. No, that's
So
very true. Yeah.
yeah.
Okay, so I have like a bunch of questions swimming through my head, but to focus more on OCD, obsessive compulsive disorder, and scrupulosity. You know, I know you've talked a little bit about not just treating kind of the natural things, or treating the natural things leading to the spiritual, but not just treating the symptoms. What has influenced your approach and understanding of OCD and the scrupulosity part?
Well, let me walk it back a little bit to when I was in grad school, and I was like, you know, we don't have any agreement here on basic principles within psychology, right? That goes back to those anthropological questions. And so I realized in graduate school and shortly afterward that most of what we call disorders, you know, in psychology or in psychiatry are really clusters of symptoms, right? So I see obsessions as a symptom, and I see compulsions as a symptom, right? So to say that there's such a thing as obsessive compulsive disorder sounds to me like saying you have fever and abdominal pain disorder, right? So if you have like intense fever, you know, high fever and intense abdominal pain, and you go to the emergency room and the physician there says, you have fever and abdominal pain disorder, and he gives you a treatment for the fever and a treatment for the abdominal pain, gives you Tylenol to reduce the fever, and gives you Percocets or some kind of painkiller for the abdominal pain. He hasn't dealt with the underlying problem, which, if it's appendicitis, for example, he's actually mistreated you. He's, you know, there's a real missing of what the underlying issue is. So most of the disorders, in quotes, that we have in the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual 5, which is, you know, what most clinicians use to diagnose, I think are just like particular symptom clusters. I don't think, for example, that I look at panic attacks as a symptom, right? So panic disorder, it's another symptom. You know, same thing with generalized anxiety, same thing with depressive episodes, same thing with manic episodes. I see all of these things as symptom clusters because we don't, within psychology, have a unified understanding of how human beings ought to be. Psychology can't really tell us how we ought to be. That's a question of philosophy and also to some degree of theology. So when I look at scrupulosity, I see that as a particular kind of symptom, right? A particular kind of obsession. Sometimes it'll have some compulsive elements to it, but I want to get to what caused that. I
Mhm.
don't look at the symptom as the problem, just like I don't look at the fever as a problem, but I want to go further back the causal chain. I want to see what's way upstream of that. And the treatment then, the further upstream you can treat, the more effective the results are going to be. And I think a lot of the modern treatments right now tend to focus too much on the symptoms, too much on the downstream, and and um, and miss kind of the more important causal factors that are further upstream.
Yeah, yeah, that makes sense. So getting to the deeper issues of what's going on.
Getting to the deeper issues, and that's really often it takes more work,
Hmm.
right? And sometimes there's initially more resistance, but I think it's far more effective, because one of the things for the treatment of scrupulosity and OCD in general is that a lot of the treatments have pretty high dropout rates in the studies. They have non-compliance rates that are pretty high. There's a lot of ways in which folks that are struggling with scrupulosity don't want to, quote, go there, end quote, with the therapist.
Yeah,
And also, I think some of the treatments, I think a lot of these treatments, exposure therapy, CBT, oftentimes are pretty harsh on the client, actually. And so it's understandable that the dropout rates would be high.
yeah, yeah. It's like I'm coming in because I'm afraid of this. Okay, let's do this, or let's watch.
Let's do this. Right.
Yeah,
And I think it tends to violate um, a sense of the person, right? So when I think about a person that's coming in and struggling with scrupulosity, I'm going to assume that there is a part of the person that is really scrupulous, and it's scrupulous for a good reason. It has a reason for that scrupulosity. And I want to understand why this is happening the way it is. I'm not just going to assume that there's random brain chemistry or a chemical imbalance or all these other sort of
yeah,
cliches that people bandy about as though they were real causal factors. I mean, they may be in the causal chain. I expect that there'd be brain chemistry, but is that really the causal factor? I want to get at what's actually driving this. And when I've done that over and over again in my practice, what I find, especially with scrupulosity, is that there's something missing. There's a dog not barking. And so that's what I started to begin to connect in my practice. There was something really missing that I never heard in folks that were scrupulous that I would expect to be there.
oh, okay, interesting. So yeah, and I guess part of that early on in your practice, what helped influence this understanding of I'm not just going to stay with the symptom, but I'm going to go for that route? Was there any resources or any main influences?
Well, when I was in grad school, I never got there. In grad school, I was really torn about whether I could actually be a Catholic psychologist. I had typical cognitive behavioral therapy training, and then I got into health psychology. So I was doing a lot of symptom focused work. How can I help people feel less anxious? How can I help them deal with chronic pain? How can I help them with habit control, smoking, weight loss, things like that? Um, but I was like, this is terrible. I know there's other things going on that I'm not getting at with this. And it's also not very effective. I mean, because a lot of times if you knock out a symptom, and Freud showed this, right? He was working with he came up with this concept of symptom substitution. He used hypnosis to help with things like paralysis, psychogenic paralysis, what would be called hysterical paralysis. So these were housewives in Austria, in Vienna at the time, and they would experience like paralysis, and he would help them over the symptom with hypnosis, but they would just develop another symptom,
Yeah.
right? So I started to think, okay, like how do we get back to the root? And it wasn't until I was out of grad school and I started to work with a psychodynamic clinician, who was much more of a depth focused, looking at depth, that I began to see, yeah, there are ways that we can work with this. It takes longer. It actually goes a lot deeper. And that was sort of the start of it. And then I brought in some of Dietrich von Hildebrandt's phenomenology. That was really helpful to me. And then a lot of Carmelite spirituality, a lot of especially St. Teresa of Avila, some St. John of the Cross, and then much later, uh, much later, St. Teresa of Lisieux.
Okay.
So.
Awesome.
Yeah. But
Definitely.
I mean, the whole idea of this has got to connect somehow to Catholicism, because
Yeah.
the way it was taught in graduate school was like religion was like this whole separate other sphere, right? And then psychology was over here, and never the two shall meet.
Yeah.
Now you
It's
went
like
to
what?
graduate school like 20 years later than I did, but I mean, in my day, you weren't even supposed to bring it up. It was like you didn't even ask about it
Yeah.
back in the
I,
day.
I went to a predominantly Christian private school, and it was treated as like a hair color. Like, oh, we'll just consider that they're Catholic. Oh, well, oh, they're Christian. And I'm like, that's it. That's all we're doing. Um, and it was very frustrating. And so, most of my my development, like you're describing, happened afterward. Happened, kind
Right.
of real time, real, in the room type stuff, with supervisors and different clients. But yeah, so
Well, and for me, a lot of trial and error in practice, right? Because I was I was one of two really identified Catholic clinicians in Indianapolis. And I pulled people from Louisville, Cincinnati, Chicago. I had people coming from a long way away because they really wanted they really wanted therapy grounded in a Catholic anthropology. So some of this, I'm really grateful to my clients. So we stumbled around, trying to sort things out. Because back in those days, there was no Catholic Psychotherapy Association. There was no Divine Mercy University. There was there wasn't hardly anything except the Society of Catholic Social Scientists at the time. So yeah, a lot of this is kind of learned in the crucible of
yeah,
making a lot of mistakes.
absolutely.
So
Yeah. So, in my work, since I do incorporate CBT and some exposure, I find that my clients, when we do those things, they want some symptom relief, almost like they're coming in, this is really distressing. We'll work on a few things, and they will see some relief, right? There's just some basic steps. They'll see some relief. But then, really, my goal with them is not to stay just there, but to look a little bit deeper. And
do a deeper, right?
I think part of less of my grad school experience, more of my my postgraduate, my supervisor experience was really developing the attachment, the psychodynamic part, and so I kind of see the looking for those core beliefs, right, about God, and I know you talk a little bit about
Right.
that too, or a lot about that, kind of attaching that from CBT with almost like a segue to look into some of those other images. What does it look like for you and a client, when you
Right.
are going into this, into these symptoms of OCD and scrupulosity? What does that look like?
So one of the things, so I go back to that dog that wasn't barking,
Yeah.
and the dog that never barked was anger at God. One thing I saw in client after client who was really struggling with scrupulosity was no anger at God that I could detect on the surface,
Okay.
um, which is really odd to me because I thought to myself, here there's this God that's so demanding, that's so like picky, that's so perfectionistic. Like where would be the anger at this God? And one of the things I figured out very early on in my practice was that there's a lot of this that's very dangerous for folks that are really struggling with scrupulosity. Anger at God tends to be something that they don't express very readily, and that it's often buried. So things that I would expect to see, I'm not seeing. So when I work with somebody that's struggling with this, I assume that they have a good reason to be scrupulous. And one of the things I don't like about CBT is that there's the idea of irrational cognitions. And actually, there's a pejorative sense to that, right? Like, and if you can understand why this part of the person believes that they have to act in this way, um, there's an incredible amount of relief that comes just from that, and from not pathologizing that, from not kind of deconstructing it, not trying to get all sort of judgmental about that, or to assume that that part of them is the enemy that needs to be suppressed.
Yeah.
Right? What I want to do is really understand it. Because once you sit with those parts of the person and you really begin to understand their story, their narrative, there's a reason why they make assumptions about God. Right? So this is what the heart of scrupulosity is for me, is to understand how I see God in this essentially non-Catholic way, right? That God is angry, that God is upset,
Yeah.
that God is demanding, that God is perfectionistic. and really work with the client in a gentle way for that to be able to come out, while also working with the other parts of the client that are frustrated with this, that want to just get over it, that just want to move on, right? There's a lot of conflict. I'm a big advocate of internal family systems therapy. And so in internal family systems therapy, you have there's this sense that there are multiple parts of us that have different perspectives, that have different ways of looking at things, that have different priorities and different values, different roles within the system,
Yeah.
almost as though we have these little personalities within us, right? And multiple personality disorder, or DID, would be an extreme manifestation where there's very little connection among these parts. Most people are more integrated. But what I would say is that there's a lot of a lack of integration among folks that have
Mm.
scrupulosity and that have OCD in general, that would be diagnosed with OCD.
Yeah.
So the question is, what's being protected against? And usually it's the idea that I'm a sinner in the hand of an angry God. I've got to meet the criterion of this God. I'm really angry at this God, but I can't accept that. And so I actually reverse the directionality of that anger, right? It's not that I'm angry at God, it's that God's angry at me, right? So the anger isn't denied, but the directionality of it's reversed. And when you've got that, then you've got a God that's actually not worth worshiping.
Yeah.
Because it starts to look more like, Quetzalcoatl, the Aztec god, demanding like
Yeah.
human sacrifice, and when and this is, I mean, this is the reason why, we have the gospel proclaimed to us, because whenever you look at natural religions, it always seems to me that natural religions devolve into human sacrifice to an angry God. I mean, you just see this over
Yeah.
and over again. Left to our own devices, that's what we come up with, right? So we need revelation. We need a revealed religion to show us that God is actually not like that. That's part of the blindness that comes with original sin and its effects. So
But that
so
mercy,
when I'm working with this, go ahead. I'm sorry.
that mercy is kind of hard to grasp on our own, right? That we need the
Oh
gospel
yeah,
to say,
totally
well,
counterintuitive.
yeah,
Totally counterintuitive. And so yeah, I mean, we're not going to reason our way there. And so we need to actually have that revealed to us, and then we have to have that shown to us in relationship with another, right? So a lot of gentleness with these folks and an appreciation for the struggle that they have been suffering with, because they're actually in an existential crisis. They're actually oftentimes very much concerned about being in mortal sin, dying in mortal sin, that existentially being destroyed for all eternity in hell. I mean, and so we're at the high stakes. This is not, these are not just folks that, are, disgruntled with their state in life or something. They're struggling at an extremely core level. And so the internal battles around these things are very intense.
yeah, absolutely. Yeah, these are big questions. They're not just the, like you said, small symptom questions or small relief questions. These
No,
are,
they're not, yeah, this isn't just some mild affliction, that kind of gets them down a little bit, makes them not be able to enjoy, their spaghetti at night sometimes. And this is like, no,
yeah,
this is life and death. This is spiritual life and death.
yeah,
And so there's a lot of desperation and a lot of polarization inside, right? A lot of internal combat. And so what I work to do is to try to understand all the different parts that are in a person. And if you do that, you actually don't have to do a lot of symptom focused work, because as soon as the parts of the person believe that they're being heard, believe that they're being understood, believe that they're being cared about, what you see is autonomic nervous system responses tend to really calm down, right? Like, and then you can help the client begin to love himself or herself.
yeah,
And that's really critical in this, because usually there's not a lot of that going on. I've never seen a case where there's a lot of, internal, like grounded, ordered self-love going on in somebody who's struggling with a lot of scrupulosity. In fact, there's a lot of self-condemnation, a lot of contempt for the self, a lot of self-berating, self-degrading, because they're not measuring up, or because they actually have the symptom at all, and so calming all that down really helps there to be a sense of hope to rise up, right? That there's a new direction, that we've broken out of this vicious cycle, into some possibilities.
Yeah. Yeah, no, and I love hearing this because so much of the work in this area is the exposure to CBT, and you're right, it's getting to the root of the problem, right? And
Right.
it's we have to solve the right problem, right?
We have to solve the right problem. And a lot of times when people come into therapy for this, right, a lot of times they're referred by priests, confessors that are frustrated, because this is an extremely difficult thing to treat just on a spiritual level. Um, but what happens is a lot of times a part comes in and they want to just get over my scrupulosity,
Mhm.
right? They don't actually want to deal with what's going on
Yeah,
underneath that. They just want to. So basically a lot of times clients come in and there are parts that are in front, kind of like Inside Out, the movie Inside Out, where there are these, like, different parts of I forget what her name was, Riley, are have taken over the control panel. You get a part that's in front taking over the control panel that wants to squash, this part, wants basically to submit. That part just to submit and to not be heard and just be silent, kind of like sadness was put in that little circle,
yeah,
the little sadness part, just stay here and, whatever. And as clinicians, we have to be really careful not to get sucked into that dynamic, because then we're like only treating some of the client, not all the client. Right. And that also pits us. We've been co-opted. We've been sucked into the agenda of a part of the person,
yeah,
and we don't want to get polarized in that.
yeah,
So my job is to love the whole client, right, including the parts, especially the parts that are misunderstood, that are suppressed, that are rejected by the client, by the parts that are in charge of the client now.
yeah,
So this requires a way of looking at ourselves that involves both the unity of the person, like we're one person, but there's also a multiplicity, right? That we have these different parts.
hmm,
And I think that's true because we're made in the image and likeness of God, right? God is 3 in 1. There's a multiplicity and a unity in God, right? We're commanded to love our neighbor as ourselves, which means that if we're to love ourselves, there's got to be a relationship
yeah,
inside,
absolutely.
right? So that means there's got to be some kind of multiplicity. If we were just a single homogeneous unitary personality, loving ourselves wouldn't make any sense.
Mhm.
And that's what I was raised in psychodynamic, right? The psychodynamic training, my psychodynamic training. And I did a lot of psychological testing. I was an expert in personality assessment. I did this for a long, long time. And I was never satisfied with the one personality because I kept seeing all different kinds of things.
Yeah,
And now I believe that a lot of psychological testing, what you get is whatever personality was most dominant
mhm.
when the test was taken, right? Whatever part was most dominant when the test was taken. And I still support psychological testing in certain situations, like personnel evaluations, fitness for duty evaluations, seminarian candidates, religious candidates for religious life, things like that. But I think what happens is, that a lot of times there's a lot that gets missed, because there's, again, parts that are not being given expression. Now, when you deal with like the Rorschach and other kinds of performance-based measures, what used to be called projective tests, you can get actually more of what's going on below the surface. But with something like scrupulosity, getting at that God image, the terrible, horrible God image that is that's driving, this sort of fearful, wretched obeisance, this frightened, servile attitude of having to get everything right. That's what you got to get at. Because think of what would happen if you could just suppress the symptom and the person still believed that. Right? If you took away all the symptoms and the person still believed that, would they even want to go to heaven? Would they want to spend forever face to face with a God like that?
Sounds
Sounds
like
horrible, right?
yeah,
So and
yeah,
that's the great dilemma when we've got these terrible God images, is that we don't want to go to hell, but we also don't really want to experience beatific vision, because of
yeah,
the fear that we have around God. We don't have that childlike confidence and trust that St. Teresa of Lisieux talks about.
true, true.
So what I'm really focused in on as a clinician is, what are the psychological aspects that get in the way of this, right? There are other aspects that other impediments that happen, spiritual impediments, moral impediments. That's not, I don't work in those realms because I'm not a spiritual director. I'm not a confessor. I don't consider myself a pastoral counselor at all. I'm a psychologist, but the psychological factors that complicate this in attachment history, in our relational history, that's the stuff. So then you can actually get at, well, what generated the God image, and then you can actually do some different types of activities to really correct those God images. And this is what we've been talking about in the Coronavirus Crisis Carpe Diem podcast. The last 5 episodes have all been about 14 different terrible God images. And then the three episodes before that, we did more of a conceptual stuff. And now we're actually going to move into Mary images, which are really important, how we see our Blessed Virgin Mary. That's what we're going to be getting into in the next week. And then I want to put together some work on how do we actually start resolving these, right? Because that's a lot of what my work as a psychologist is about.
Yeah.
How do we actually, and there's one, I'll just tell you, there's one critical thing, and that is, can you experience God as he really is, right? So that's the only way that this can be corrected. You can't study your way there. I've had plenty of clients, doctoral degrees in philosophy, theology. They've tried to study their way there. That's not going to work. The one thing that most differentiates those in my practice that get better from those that don't is, can you hold on to, at a gut level, at an experiential level, a providential God who cares and loves you specifically? That's the key element. And that's what we tend to avoid, right? That's what we tend to run away from, because we give into our God images. We actually believe that God is whatever that God image is, and then we avoid him, which makes sense if that was true, right? So
that's interesting, because that's also, I don't know if you've read Sherry Waddell's Forming Intentional Disciples. It's a threshold of conversion is that you believe that God is personal and that God cares. And if
yes,
we don't believe that, then we can't grow deeper in our faith. So hearing you say that, yeah, that makes total sense. Right? We
yeah,
need that healing experience of our image of God to believe that he's loving, he cares, he is who he says he is, not who we just interpret him to be.
right.
That healing is essential, and that it is an extremely personal development and conversion, that it can't be kind of only this intellectual battle, right? It can't
Right. It's got to be in the 4 zones. I talk about not just the mind, right? Where a lot of this, that's where you often start with folks that are struggling with scrupulosity, is in the mind. But it's got to be in the heart. So there's got to be these emotional aspects to it. It's got to be in the soul, obviously, right? The spiritual aspects, but also in the body, right? Because so much of the time we hold all this trauma in our body, and we need to be able to unpack that too. So there's this what a psychologist colleague and friend of mine, Dr. Peter Martin, talks about. He talks about this internal evangelization. This is where our soul actually evangelizes the parts of us
yeah.
that believe these things about God. And think about it, right? When you're in your dark place, there's a whole different way that you look at the world, right? And there's a different way that you perceive things. The vision gets narrow. There's a whole set of memories that go with that, a whole set of attitudes that go with that, a whole set of impulses, a whole set of emotions that go with that. And so these modes of operating, or these parts, as I would say, within an internal family systems network, we want to actually be able to reach out to them and understand what kind of experiences they're holding for us, so that those can actually be worked through and healed, right? And when you look at folks that have pretty intense scrupulosity, there's usually some pretty significant attachment related wounds. And if there's not traumas, right, and a lot of times there's trauma, but if there's not trauma, there's at least attachment wounds that have led to the generalization of God having the characteristics of the people that wounded them, right? And so to be able to heal that is really critical, right? And then you can actually be liberated from it. You're not just fighting against it. You're not just suppressing it. You're not just trying to overcome it. You're not just, papering over the surface of it. You're actually resolving the underlying wound. And I think you're either going to do that here on earth, or you're going to have to do that in purgatory. I think purgatory is also a place where we resolve all kinds of natural level disorder that we didn't resolve when we were walking the face of the earth before death. So I think it's not just about, the restitution for sin. It's also about the correction of disorder, not just in the spiritual realm, but also in the natural realm.
Yeah, encountering God for who he really is, right? Not and
Well, and being able to, having a solid enough natural foundation to be able to, right?
I like what you said about, you know, in CBT would be called cognitive distortions, right? These
Right,
irrational ways, unhelpful ways of
right,
thinking that, without being super judgmental about them, that those do reveal important things about ourselves. And to even give clients credit and say, you learned to survive, or you learned to
right,
make sense of
right.
you, and it really is that they learned, right? That, this
Yep.
is something in their environment, like you're saying, with the family system, that they said, oh, this is how I exist. This is how I
This
live.
is how I survive. And I credit those parts for having brought the person through those difficult times,
Absolutely. Yeah.
and like help them to survive. But usually they're trapped in the past, right? They don't realize that it's not 1986 or 1964 or whatever, 1992, wherever that wound happened, and that that part was forced into that position of having to take on that burden to bring the person, to help the person through, to protect the person and help the person through that really dangerous situation. um yeah, and I think a lot of times parents don't even realize, right,
Yeah.
how these things can happen. It doesn't require malice on the part of parents. It doesn't require there to be this, you know this ill will or anything like that. It's just, I've got 7 kids myself. There have been times where, I've been really wounding towards my kids, and not wanting to be. But I think, a lot of times parents don't realize, if you're 6 foot tall like I am, 6'2" like I am, and you've got a toddler that's standing, 2.5 feet tall, you know, it's like, it would be like me looking up at somebody who is like 12 feet tall, bigger, huger. I mean, it's massive, like a giant, right? And we don't often realize the way that the impact that some of our words, our tone, our physical bearing, all that has on kids. That's
Absolutely.
only something that we're starting to understand now.
Yeah.
So,
Very true. Yeah. So how? And so I know in your podcast you talk about God images, God concepts, and even those self and
right.
images, self concepts. How does how do you begin to heal those? And I guess also, how does that anger role, healing that anger, um,
Right.
at the controls? How do you approach healing within all that?
So let's just define what a God image is first, because we haven't been real clear about that. So the God image is how my heart feels God to be in the moment, right? My God image is who my emotions tell me that God is. It's very subjective. It's driven by factors that are outside of my awareness, often, and it can be very far away from who I profess God to be, right? Who I profess God to be, is like the catechism definition, right? Or the Baltimore catechism definition, right?
Yeah.
That's who I endorse, that's who I profess. But my God image it's really subjective. It's really right brain. It's really intuitive. It's that sort of that sense, that felt sense of who God is. And so that's always developed experientially, right? So the way that heals is also experiential, right? You're not going to solve this like you could an algebra equation, right? We're going to have to go back into contact with the living God. So there's kind of 2 ways that I think about doing this. One is, as a clinician, right, for them to experience something of the love of God through me, okay, because sometimes it's just too terrifying to actually approach God, right? So to reflect the love of God through me, to be a conduit of that. And then secondly, to be able to experience it directly in relationship with God, right? So sometimes we'll use the saints too. A lot of times the God the Father could be, especially you imagine a situation in which, there has been sexual abuse by dad. Okay. Very hard to do father work immediately with that. I will often work with, sometimes in those cases, you can't even use a human being. So I'll use angels, right? The person's
Hmm.
guardian angel,
Okay.
experience the love of God through that. Non-corporal being, no chance of being, sexually abused there. But the Blessed Virgin Mary, Saint Joseph is a very common one that I will bring in, and 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 begin to work with how that part experiences right? So this is what, I mentioned, Dr. Martin talks about this internal evangelization is sort of bringing God into, or bringing the love of God into, could be through another person like myself, into these spaces where it has never been before. And it puts a whole new spin on, like, the people that have walked in darkness have seen a great light. Like if you think about all those readings that we hear in Advent, like the good news is actually being spread within our system, not just to the parts that go to, that experience God in prayer, go to mass, or, carry out our religious obligations and so forth, but to the parts that really don't know God,
Yeah.
right? Because they've been so separated. So a lot of that is through prayer. Some of it is through like guided imagery. Some of it is through some body work, where you might really just notice what's happening. Some people call this mindfulness. I think it's a problematic word for a number of reasons, but I will think about it in terms of recollection on a natural level. You'll talk about using the faculty of the imagination to be able to see some of these things. And that's actually gotten really popular in the trauma literature generally, right? There's a lot of talk about internal guides, for example, and I have even seen secular approaches that talk about the Blessed Virgin Mary as being one of these guides. Now they will look at the Blessed Virgin Mary in that situation as sort of being like a part of the person. They're finding their own inner wisdom or whatever.
Huh.
I don't look at it that way, right? I'm saying, no, she's, she shows up, she's there, she's, she's your mother, right?
Yeah.
So, I don't look at her as like one in a lineup along with Gaia and, Vishnu and, whoever else,
Yeah.
there might be a spirit guide. But the connection there in the experiential relational contact is what's healing. I will use imagery, for example, of like an English garden, with an 8-foot stone wall and a wood door with like a little peephole in it, and you could talk to Jesus outside the door, right? And just the part could talk to Jesus outside the door, see that he doesn't burst in, right? For example, and take over and start criticizing or whatever. Sometimes you get a little bit of that, but then you're figuring, oh, that's the God image, right? That's not actually who God really is. So you kind of work with that clinically. And we're actually figuring out ways in Souls and Hearts to actually bring some of this stuff to life. So you don't actually have to do it in therapy. It's not just a purview of therapy.
Yeah.
But yeah, to really enter into relationship. And it's one of those things, Adam, where if you seek, you're going to find. But what happens is a lot of times people just give into those God images and they flee. And if you flee from God long enough, he's not going to intrude. He's going to respect
Yep.
the lack of desire, right? And that's what I think actually leads a lot of people to wind up in a really terrible place, is because they fled from God. They didn't understand who God really was. They didn't trust enough that he is who he says he is, and so a lot of what I'm doing in that kind of a position is just sort of standing by while the client just tolerates a sort of titrated, increased experience of who God is. And then also helped correct, like, and so I'm trained in a variety of trauma modalities. I'll sometimes use EMDR in this. I'll sometimes, there's a lot of IFS trauma stuff that I will do. But the idea of like, could this part here, Christ say something different, right? And I actually believe that God works in these, that works in this therapy, like he's actually present. I can't state that definitively. I'm not a spiritual director, but you can tell when something really seems to be from God versus something that seems to be coming from the part of the person, or the sometimes sometimes you may even get some external temptations or things like that. There's ways to navigate some of that stuff in internal family systems as well. So
Yeah, that's great. And I think what I'm hearing too is it's all grounded, like you said, on this foundation that we are made in the image and likeness of God, that we can have a relationship with ourselves,
right.
and that we need to evangelize ourselves too, that we need to take the gospel to those parts of us that haven't received it, or haven't
Yep.
received it fully, or the parts where, it might be buried down deep, that
Right.
and even a part of scrupulosity, sometimes I can be like, well, I'm supposed to go out and evangelize other people, and I'm supposed to be a good Catholic or whatever that might look like, but it's, we have to start with ourselves, right? We have to, and I like that image of, maybe just opening a slot for Jesus to look in,
Right.
and
Right.
hopefully being, hopefully opening that door and saying yes. I think that's a beautiful approach to it. And so I think my last question would be in all this is, since CBT is usually the predominant approach to it, do you see any overlap or integration in looking for these God images in any of these kind of behavioral approaches?
I mean, I think there's probably more overlap in clinicians' work. Like good clinicians tend to look more similar in what they do than how the treatments look, on paper, right? So to the degree that a treatment, a given modality is or a given theoretical orientation is helping, there's going to be some similarities,
Yeah.
right? And it's clear that some clinicians using CBT have had good results with scrupulosity. I don't know how much of that I would attribute necessarily to the CBT itself.
Yeah.
Okay. I'm not a huge fan of CBT,
Yeah.
because I see it as too surface oriented. I see it as too, and again, I don't like the idea of irrational cognitions. I think it does exacerbate some suppression, right? We're gonna override these thoughts, and we're not gonna really
Yeah.
understand where they come from and stuff like that. So, and I have, frankly, a little bitterness about the way that I was taught CBT and how that was sort of rammed down my throat when I was in graduate school. And this is the prime modality and stuff like that. So some of that's my own stuff. Um, but but the exposure therapy, I think a lot of that, you are exposing what the real issue is. You're not just sort of forcing the person into confrontation with whatever they're scrupulous about, but you're taking it back. You're actually exposing, you're bringing to the surface, right? It's a different kind of exposure at a deeper level. You're bringing to the surface like what the real problem is, which is in the understanding of God, in the understanding of the self, and in the understanding of the relationship between self and God, right? Because I think what a lot of folks at Scrupulosity are going for, they're not even going for the love of God. They're actually going to being tolerated by God, right?
Yeah.
Right? They're actually going for not being destroyed by God, right? And that's kind of a hard thing to get really excited about, right? Can you imagine the evangelization? Yep, I love God. He doesn't destroy me. That's, he's got my heart,
He doesn't destroy me.
yeah,
Lightning bolt.
that's right, but I think a lot of times that's what it's like in Scrupulosity. I mean, it wouldn't be articulated that way necessarily, but a lot of this stuff got laid down before the person even had the capacity for representational thought, before they could even put experiences into words, right? So a lot of the stuff is pre-verbal, and just being able to be with it in a way where it could be given a name, where it could be described, it could be put into words. Now we can bring the intellect and the will into this. And I think a lot of times what we do is we get caught up in because a lot of times people that are scrupulous are much more left brain, they're much more conceptual, they're much more analytical, they're much more about thoughts than they are about feelings, and clinicians can sometimes go with that and be sucked into that like one hemisphere, right? That one kind of way of looking at things. And I think we need to actually very gently, bring in these other elements. And then I think you can have a lot more success. It's a lot gentler. It's a lot more comprehensive. It's more holistic. It appreciates these parts. But I think sometimes folks that have this kind of style, they don't like the idea that there are parts, right? They don't want to start opening that. That's really, you have to deal with that. There's a lot of resistance to the idea of multiplicity of self, but I would say that comes from the parts that are generally in control, right? They don't want to cede that primacy, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
Because they're afraid that if that happens, then all Hades is going to break loose inside, right? And they could actually wind up worse off than they are now.
Yeah, I mean, it's scary to think there's parts of you that you haven't looked at, and that might be, moving around and influencing you, and you haven't looked at that. That's pretty
Well,
anxiety.
look at the example of the saints, Adam, right? What do the saints say? Do they say, actually, by the grace of God, I'm very ordered inside. I have achieved a pinnacle of human experience and functioning. No, what do they say, right? They talk about the disorder inside, right? And it's not because they're more disordered than the rest of us. It's because they have a deep sense of the love of God and the acceptance of God and the mercy of God that allows them to see themselves as they actually are. I make the argument that in the Garden of Eden, we know what happened to the body after original sin, right? We know that death entered the world, and sickness, illness, and pain and suffering, and a whole different physical kind of labor, right? Work, pain and childbirth. There was a devastating impact on the body as a result of original sin. And I argue that the same thing happened to the psyche. The same thing happened to our psychological functioning. By analogy, I make this argument, only we don't see it. We don't understand it in the same way because
Yeah,
there's a lot of blindness that comes in to being able to understand really where we are psychologically. So, yeah, I mean, it takes a lot of humility to be able to acknowledge, the disorder that we have. It takes a lot of trust, and confidence in God to be able to get at that depth. And that's what the saints are reflecting, when they talk about how they see themselves.
yeah, that trust piece is huge, and the patience and the willingness to go into those dark places. And I think that going back to what you said in the beginning of, and maybe this is kind of where we can close it a little bit, is not being afraid to go into therapy looking for that worldview, for that perspective, having those interview questions, having an idea of what you're looking for is so critical, so that you can build a rapport, build a relationship with your clinician, and then you
Right.
can build that trust when it does get scary.
I would look at the clinician as a guide and companion on an adventure.
Yes.
Right. That's how I really look at it. Not as some white coated medical professional that's going to give you the answers, right? While you lie on the table, passively, and, and there's some sort of pathologyectomy where he just opens you up and takes out the pathology or whatever while you're under anesthetic. It doesn't work like that, right? It's much more and that's how we look at souls and hearts too. It's like, we want to be like with people on their journeys to be able to have that connection so they know they're not going through this alone, and to be that bridge to be able to connect them to themselves and also to God, right? Especially with this God image stuff, right? It helps a lot to have somebody say, no, it's okay, God can take it, like he can hear what you really think and feel, right? And can you bring that to him and see what happens?
Yeah.
Maybe it's not going to be what you expect, you
Mm.
know.
Yeah.
So
I love that approach. Therapist, psychologists, we don't have all the answers, right? We can't just, there's no simple fix, but it really is us walking with our clients.
mm-hmm.
And hopefully we're walking towards Christ. The therapist is walking and we're walking together. And yeah, we're walking really as they build that relationship with themselves and looking for God in that process. So hearing that as a foundation, that really speaks to me. That's awesome. Um,
Yeah.
so this has been great. I really love talking with you, and I'm hoping we can maybe do this some more. And
Yeah, it's been great. We'll see what we'll see, I'm curious as to what your viewers and what your listeners think of this kind of thing, if this is interesting to them, if this is helpful.
yeah,
You have a place where you get feedback, I imagine on YouTube, right?
so
People can leave
it's
comments and
down.
stuff.
If they're watching it, it's down here somewhere. There's a comment. So please feel free to comment, hit that like button, that subscribe button, whatever other buttons are down there. But yeah, please leave questions, comments, and Dr. Peter, where can they reach you?
I'll give you my direct email address.
Yeah,
So you can always go to the website soulsandhearts.com, right? Soulsandhearts.com. And then my email address, the one I use, is crisis@soulsandhearts.com. You can reach me at crisis@soulsandhearts.com. And my cell phone, 317-567-9594. You can text
awesome.
me or give me a call. you have something you want to say. But yeah, definitely want to bring together people. It's an overlap with what you guys are doing here on the Color of Thought, right? That we want people that really want to bring together the natural and the spiritual realms, right? And look at that interface. So
Yeah.
yeah.
Cool. Yeah, and maybe we can get Daniel on here from Color of Thought sometime.
I think we should get him. I think we should get him on here. And then you got to write a blog for us too. Get you on Souls and Hearts. Get you a little exposure over there too, Adam. So
Cool. All right.
it's been
Well,
great to
thank you
be
so
here.
much,
Thank you.
and thank you everyone for watching. And again, if you have any comments or questions, please feel free to comment, email us, and reach out. But thank you, and God bless.
God bless.